Okay, welcome to another Lit Matters. This revision video will focus on J.B. Priestley's And Inspector Calls, and in particular his use of dramatic irony. And a couple of keywords there on the screen for you to get your head around that will be relevant to this particular video. So with the aim of which is to consider how, where and why Priestley makes use of this dramatic technique. And this is particularly good if you study EdXL for GCSE, as 40% of those marks for the Inspector Calls essay go to you for demonstrating a sound understanding and of the historical context and an insight into the social, political, historical context. So this is particularly relevant there. Right, so a starting point then, dramatic irony, a definition. Well, it's a technique where a writer allows the audience to know more than a character or in the novel or a play. And there develops a contrast between what you know as the audience member or as the reader and what certain characters know, i.e. you know more. You are better informed about his or her situation and thus you are more engaged. Priestley uses it throughout the play, but particularly in relation to Mr. Burling in Act 1, and this is the scenes that we're going to focus on. At this point, it's perhaps worth thinking about other contexts in which you might have come across some dramatic irony. This is not limited to Inspector Calls. You see this right the way through literature and works of creative fiction from Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet. They, think of their final scene where they don't know the other is not really dead, but you're still alive, and proceed to commit suicide, right up to EastEnders or modern soap operas that use it fairly often. So what's the point of this? Why does he do this? And as ever in literature essays and exams, don't just spot things, whether they're language devices or dramatic techniques. Don't just spot it and say, yeah, I can see this. You need to be explaining the effect of it and how far and how effectively you can explain the writer's intentions and the effects, and we'll decide how many marks you get. So dramatic irony is used by Priestley because it engages the reader. It makes the play more interesting. It makes the spectacle more spectacular because the reader audience feel that they are more informed, they're more insightful, and they are, in some senses, in the know. They're gratified by their extra knowledge, and so they can perhaps see the mistakes a character is making, or they can predict how their character's particular mindset or actions, where that might take them, and where that might lead them. And particularly in an Inspector Calls, Priestley wants us to hate Mr. Burling. He wants us to reject Arthur Burling and his politics and his worldview. Especially when Arthur Burling is giving his little lecture, his sort of sermon to Sheila, to Eric, and to Gerald. Priestley wants us to see him as an utter moron. He keeps saying, I'm speaking as a hard-headed man of business and a practical man of business. And Priestley wants us to identify this man as a moron and completely disassociate ourselves from his mistakes, from his all-round idiocy, and critically from his right-wing politics. And thus Priestley is manipulating us in a way, attempting to make socialists of us all. So we're going to look at a couple of quotations where you could use this in an exam, because we start to see some errors in Arthur Burling's analysis and predictions of historical matters and political matters. This helps us to understand that many of his other attitudes and opinions may be wrong too. We'll start with one of the perhaps more subtle quotations. I don't think every candidate up and down the country at GCSE will be able to refer to this quotation and talk about it. Burling is fairly convinced there's not going to be any trouble with the workforce, with the labour movement, that there's a lot of wild talk. This obviously is not true, and the labour movement grows in strength through the 1920s and sees the first Labour government towards the end of the 1920s. On the way there, you have the general strike in 1926. Millions of workers across the country, particularly in heavy industry and transport, they all walk out of work at the same time, striking for better pay and conditions. So Burling's predictions seem fairly stupid and fairly uninformed. in this particular instance, you have about 2 million workers going out on strike, causing massive problems for the government and for the economy. It's worth perhaps thinking about Priestley's intentions here. I think he's often talking to two different sections of his audience, although his theatre-going audience might be more middle class, and the play perhaps encourages any would-be capitalists or comfortable, complacent members of the bourgeoisie not to underestimate the strength of working class unity. I think he's also talking to the workers themselves and those poorer members of society, not to underestimate the strength of their collective power and the effect of their solidarity or their unity. Okay, the second quotation. This one is very obvious. This will not be lost on any reader when Berling is dismissive of the prospect of war in 1912. He says it's going to be fiddlesticks, by which he means rubbish. I'm not buying this. There's no chance of wars coming. And of course, anyone and everyone in the audience will know exactly what happened in 1914 to 1918. The nature and the extent of the carnage, of the suffering and the bloodshed makes Berling look particularly stupid. And part of that upper class sort of British and European establishment that really had no idea what they were doing in taking their countries to war. It was the first mechanized war, so you saw for the first time the introduction of military technology such as tanks, use of gas, aeroplanes, and crucially machine guns that could decimate an army in a morning in a way that previous military technology of having rifles that you had to reload and fire, everything was transformed, and the early 20th century Europe really had no idea what it was getting itself in for in the autumn of 1914. Berling is a symbol of that, a representative of that class that looks so callous and stupid. The third quotation you could use in an essay or an exam situation refers to the Titanic. Almost everyone will be able to get this. This is Priestley really slapping you around the face by now, saying, "Do you get it yet? This guy's an idiot. Don't listen to him. Don't trust him. Don't align with him. Don't agree with his politics. He's a moron." Of course, Berling predicts that the Titanic, what a wonderful bit of technology, is unsinkable. Here's a bit of extra information for you. You can pause this slide if you'd like to see some of the detail of that story. But of course, you know how it ends up. Although it was the height of technology for its time, departing Southampton for New York, sadly doesn't survive her maiden voyage and meets a watery end. But is highly symbolic of this hubris and this hubristic approach of the upper classes, perhaps, or of the establishment class in Edwardian times. This statement of size, of power, of magnitude, and of strength that comes undone. And if you're not clear on the hubris or hubristic as an adjective, check out my other video on the Aristotelian terms in Macbeth. You can use a number of them in an Inspector Calls or any play you come across, perhaps. Okay, the fourth quotation, which is slightly more subtle, and I don't think every candidate will be able to comment on this, but is perhaps the most galling and irritating, ludicrous of them all, is when Berling is saying to these young people, "Oh, you don't understand. You'll understand when you have kids of your own and you'll be having a nice little party one day, sometime around about 1940. Yeah, they'll all be lovely. You'll be sipping champagne, raising a glass, and you'll be talking and thinking like me." And of course, it couldn't be further from the truth. In 1940, the Blitz is raging. And if you're not clear what that is, have a look at these pictures here. Go and look it up. It was a period of sustained strategic bombing by the Nazis and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, on London and various other British cities. They were attacked repeatedly. 100 tons of high explosives were dropped over a period of 37 weeks, and this killed 40,000 civilians, so not even members of the armed forces, but very innocent men, women and children of all ages. And to put that in some kind of context, an atrocity perhaps you're more familiar with, something like September the 11th 2001, kills around about 3,000 people, The Blitz kills 40,000 civilians night after night after night to reach that tally. So if you're sat there in 1945, 46 and you're seeing this play for the first time, this is the one that will particularly wind you up, and I would think this would be the one that would make you, not just dismiss Berling as an idiot, but make you angry, engage you, wind you up to be politically active against this kind of a man and this kind of a thinking, this kind of a way of thinking. So to finish then, a couple of tasks you might want to take away and that you could go and do some written work on. I suggest you do it under time conditions and you sort of work against the clock, but perhaps try and put some of these ideas down on paper, commit pen to paper. Okay, I hope that was useful for you. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and put in the comments if this was useful for you, if there's any particular requests or how it could be improved. Okay, see you next time.
Pressure.